today is all about relationship building and starting that conversation and getting the engagement. So if everybody's prepared to just have a little bit of flexibility around our finishing time, I'd really like to be able to just progress with the Q&A. So I'll ask all of the speakers from the last session to come up and start your thinking around questions. You've got quite a diversity to choose from, with Andy talking environmental stewardship, Justine talking about Macquarie Island eradication, Charlton leading our operations, Jaimie talking about sustainable fisheries, and Rob, if you have a question on sea ice. Opening it up. Stephen. You can come and use this one, Rob, if you like.
I have a question. I have a question for Justine. When you look at the seabird populations you've been monitoring, do you have an idea of how close they are to pre-introduction levels? Of course, a difficult question because there might not have been sufficient monitoring, but I would like to hear your thoughts on that if you have any. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. I have lots of thoughts on that. And so do my collaborators working on this project. So there's many people in that team. And one of the good things is we have these conversations. And one of the things we're asking is, what are we tracking for and what's recovery? And it's a classic question beyond Macquarie Island and very pertinent in Australian landscapes. We don't have any indication of what the population size was because when people arrived, they brought feral animals. But we do have an understanding of what we predict the carrying capacity of the island to be. So we've done some really great work in habitat modelling, and so Dr. Jez Bird, who's part of this project, has actually quantified and mapped on the island potential habitat for these seabirds. And the other thing that we're actually doing some work this coming summer with SAFE, where we're hoping to see if we can understand with peat cores and looking at isotope signatures throughout the landscape where we might find past evidence of birds and get some kind of indication of density. But the ocean's abundant, so we don't think the ocean's a limiting factor. So we're trying to answer. Thanks.
Hi, question for Justine again. In terms of the eradication program that you spoke of and eradicating all the ferals in there, it sounds like there were baits that were used for rabbits, rats, mice, and you mentioned that there were impacts upon the birds of prey. How much did that impact the population size of birds of prey down there, and how long has it taken to recover, if they have recovered at all?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Misty. Great question. So about 500 plus birds that we know of died through ingesting poisoned rabbits. So they were birds that were found in the landscape. We don't know how many died at sea, but we know how many were left on the island. And so we did look at the skua population. And as I said, initially breeding success was really impacted. There was less birds, there was less chicks raised, but actually over time it's through natural population growth. So it was in 2011 that we lost those birds from the population, and we're now 11 years on. And we are seeing the population is looking quite stable and not returned yet, but it's on trend to do that. And we've been doing models and understanding, and the Tasmanian Parks and Wildlife Service will continue to monitor the population. So for those birds, it's looking okay. And there's also been some work by the Tasmanian State Government on the giant petrels, and that work's published and out in the domain as well. So it's uncomfortable to poison animals, and it happens in every eradication project. But there are things that we've learned that could be done to reduce that, given it's not comfortable. You could do supplementary feeding and things like that. But actually, again, it's sort of tracking for what's the end game, and you could see it as collateral damage. So the populations are looking stable and recovered now.
Sorry, just to follow up on that, have there been any ideas on how we can go about eradicating pest species without using those levels of poisons in those sensitive areas? I understand that similar effects are happening on Norfolk Island, for example. Have we learnt, have any suggestions come out from your study, your research, of how we can do that in other similar environments?
Yeah, so the beauty of Macquarie Island is it has implications for so many, globally, for pest eradications, and Macquarie was the first multiple species of that scale to ever been undertaken in the world, and it still remains kind of the showcase story that's looked upon. So for Lord Howe, Christmas Island are looking at it. Gough Island was undertaken. A whole range of islands. They've looked to Macquarie and what was learnt from Macquarie. There's a whole science around eradication and pest eradication. In 15 years, we might not be using poisons for some species. So there's a whole gene drive in mice, genetic modification for sterile mice. But some landscapes really do preclude themselves from those types of interventions. And so for the loss of 500 birds, with the logistic challenges for Macquarie Island, and an island that has so many threatened species, it's actually, you could say it's an amazing success that so few birds died. And so the eradication science isn't new. And sometimes you do have to kill things, and it's uncomfortable, but the conservation outcomes are huge.
Thank you. Question for Charlton. Dana's presentation talked about unusual heavy snowfall as a result of the warming this season, and some of the future scenarios still postulate about high levels of snow on the interior. What would that do to your ability to get up to the dome?
Becomes a lot slower. So there has been an awful lot of work primarily by Taz and the team where we have looked at the terrain and route analysis, and also shared experiences with the US program and the French program in their traverses, both to the pole and to other locations. And we have got some good data on the effect of snow accumulation on vehicle performance and weights, and we think we've got a parameter that's going to support our operations, but you can never say never. There can be unforeseen events that really change the dynamic. So it might be a temporal thing that causes a halt to the traverse, but the route data itself is, as much as we've got, is fairly robust on our understanding of the way we get up there. I think the bigger issue is actually the first time we go up there is more proving the route is likely to be more challenging than to subsequent weather, just from the frequency of sastrugi and other characteristics of the snow.
What's sastrugi, Charlton?
The bumpy bits on the snow. So.
I have a question actually for either Charlton or Andy. Both of you, Andy, you talked about an environmental impact minimisation strategy, and Charlton, you highlighted the fuel-intensive nature of our Antarctic program. What is the Australian Antarctic program doing around energy efficiency and trying to reduce our carbon footprint?
I might just start a quick observation that the Antarctic program for a decade or more has had a really good try at this. We're one of the first countries to put major commercial wind turbines up in Antarctica at Mawson Station. We've got a good solar set up at Casey Station, but they're add-ons to stations that weren't designed in a modern sense, and I think the real transformation is going to come as we rebuild the stations in a completely different methodology and approach, where at the core of how they operate, it's based around zero emissions, or as very close as possible. So that's the step change. Andy?
Thanks for stealing my thunder, Charlton. Yeah, in the process of designing and looking at feasibilities for new stations, that energy efficiency is a really critical component. And one of the really pleasing changes for me over the last few years that I've seen in the process that we're going through now around modernisation is that we've embedded environmental and sustainability principles at the ground level of our design for new stations. So the images that Charlton showed in his presentation around the futuristic station, energy efficiency and environmental footprint are embedded in those designs, and they're fundamental principles that flow all the way through, including in the construction, the materials, the delivery and the operation of those stations. So you're right, it's the next stage for us, but it's absolutely a priority for us in terms of how we modernise our stations. Yeah.
Thanks. Damien, there's a question at the back.
Peter Murphy from the Noetic Group. Another one for Justine. That locally extinct parrot, and I think it was a rail, is there an active consideration of a plan to reintroduce the associated subspecies back into Macquarie?
The quick answer is no, but there's researchers who are interested in doing the research at the moment to answer, to be on the front foot to answer should that happen. There are people interested because it's a subspecies. There's multiple subspecies on the neighbouring islands, and so the candidates are there, and so we feel like we're doing some work to find habitat available and what this, you know, that the food is there, and we've kind of shown that it is. So it's sort of now probably requires a bit more policy framing and discussions with people involved, particularly the state government, because they are also custodians or the managers, land managers. But there's certainly a lot of interest in the conversation.
Justine, Johnny.
Yeah, I've got one for Andy. Andy, would you be able to give us a sense of what's been done in sort of the shipping area to prevent introduction of marine invasive species, particularly with the increase in shipping and all the extra ships coming in and the Noyina? I know that you've been thinking about that lately and doing some work. Can you just give us a feel for that?
Yeah, thanks, Johnny. Yeah, it's been a long-held, I guess, get-out-of-jail card for Antarctic operations that when you drive a ship through sea ice, it cleans the bottom of the hull and therefore we've got nothing to worry about. Most of us know that that's not the case, and there's lots of nooks and crannies, and Noyina's no different. In fact, it's probably got more nooks and crannies than most. So we've been looking at approaches to cleaning the hull. There's equipment that goes on the ship. The ship actually comes with a hull cleaning machine. I can't remember what it's called now. And that's about cleaning the hull prior to the season. We've just done a survey of the ship that's the AVIC this year, and we're actually about to undertake a hull clean before it goes to Macquarie Island. And we're also going to look at the effectiveness of that cleaning. And we may be able to start looking at things like eDNA, which is possibly what Leonie was talking about, as a way of using that as a monitoring tool as well to understand which species are here and whether those species can be detected through eDNA and eRNA in Antarctica and those locations. At the moment, it's very labour intensive and it's quite expensive, and it's really basically it's divers doing hull inspections. But we're really keen to incorporate that into our monitoring plans and continually improve and evaluate how effective our systems are in reducing that biofouling risk.
Thanks, Johnny. Stephen, did you have a question? I think I saw you with your hand up.
Another one for Andy, and that is, it was a fantastic presentation on legacy contaminants, and I wondered the extent to which emerging contaminants are being monitored, personal care product contamination or flame retardants and so on. It's not really my area, but I was quite fascinated by the fact that there have been some records of these products in the Antarctic recently.
Yes, there's a lot of, there's a recent publication, I think they said there's 350,000 chemicals in the environment now that are synthetic. And we all know from things like asbestos and PFAS that these chemicals that have been invented to problem solve end up being problems for us and future generations. We have looked at PFAS and we've done some monitoring around our stations. At the moment, there's not an enormous amount of work going on in that space, but part of our site assessments will be a broader sweep and evaluation of the chemicals present. Some of our water treatment systems and our effluent treatment systems could be really improved to reduce that discharge into the environment as well. So things like microplastics and the like can potentially be taken out of the system prior to it being released back into the environment.
Thanks, Andy. And Nathan first.
This is a question for Rob. Rob, you heard how Charlton talked about all the great new logistics. What would be your dream use of that logistics now that you've seen
it? Good question, Nathan. Yes. It would be to establish a monitoring program that has a repeat element in it. So to use all of those wonderful things that we saw from Charlton and also from Phil earlier to really home in on across the board atmosphere, ice, ocean, ice sheet, biology, biogeochemistry, etc. Throwing everything at it, but having moorings that go up and down in the ice, having long-term or long-range drones that go across, and having the ship to cut down, and the ship being equipped with long-term observing kind of systems. So having this integrated package that would really use all of that, fantastic. It really is a very exciting time. I agree with everyone. And using that to the full, but integrating it. So
Could you talk
that
about
would
the
be my,
FODs?
sorry.
Could you talk about the FODs and what that will do for sea ice research, the forward outboard deployment system?
Yeah. So we're planning a number of systems on the ship, and one of which is to have an ice thickness measurement system that goes off the front or off the side of the ship. And this is an electromagnetic induction system that measures actually the distance between the bottom of the ice and the instrument itself. And if you combine that with a laser and a snow thickness radar, then you can get a continuous measure of sea ice thickness and snow cover thickness every time the ship goes across the sea ice zone. And one thing I didn't mention is that we know a lot about that with sea ice, but what we don't know is that, and what the volume of sea ice is, and until we're able to do that, the models will continue to not perform very well. And it's also a really strong indicator of response of sea ice. It's very, very sensitive to changing wind and ocean patterns and temperature, etc. So if we can measure and monitor thickness well, then we can really make giant leaps as well.
Thanks, Rob. We've got Keith and then we've got Drew.
Thanks for, so many things. Surely that thing you're talking about can go on a drone to measure sea ice thickness. That's got to be possible. The question I had was actually about rats and pregnant ones, but just wondering how you have confidence that you don't have rats on your vessels, and also if you've seen the biosecurity capra beetle test where they sort of vacuum up in shipping containers and look at the eDNA to see if they've got capra beetle, and I don't know, can you do that with a rat? Just as a thought.
Yeah, sure, and Andy can follow up on this this answer. So we have a wonderful thing in Hobart that's got 4 legs and is really cute, and it's a rodent detection dog. And it goes over the vessel and the cargo every time pre-departure to Macquarie Island, and on most occasions, if the ship's not going via Antarctica, the dog goes down too. And this dog is obsessed with rats, like any good detection dog. So that's an incredibly great screening process. Rats are messy too. So unlike the capra beetles, which are subtle, rats, if they're there, can be easy to find if you look hard enough. And the dogs are great at that. But Andy, you might want to follow up.
Yeah, thanks, Juz. Yeah, the rodent detector dog is extremely cute. But not allowed to talk to him when he's working. But that's just one layer of defence. So, the key for us is having multiple layers of defence. So we have a really robust cargo biosecurity system, which involves multiple checks and balances along the way. We also have a comprehensive baiting program and bait stations in all of our cargo that goes to Macquarie Island. And we have on-island response procedures as well. We even had an incident this year where a number of dirty bait stations were detected. So our processes worked. Fortunately, they were old bait stations. There was no evidence of any fresh rodent activity. So we learned from that, and we've got a new process in place for the coming season where we'll buy new bait stations, and every bait station we know will be clean when it goes in there. So it's about setting those multiple layers of defence up, but also monitoring that and responding when you do have incidents and looking for improvement. We're very fortunate compared to somewhere like Lord Howe Island, because we know when there's a ship going to Macquarie Island, and it's usually us, and all our cargo and our personnel go through that checking process before they get on the vessel and before they disembark as well.
Thanks, Andy. I think we've got Drew next. Yep.
Thanks, Nicole. Question for Charlton. At Little Dome Sea, we know that the European drilling program is only 5 kilometres away, and that's a scientific cooperation about replicating the results and so on. But the Concordia station, the European station, is 20 or 30 k away. Is there any logistic cooperation built in, or what will be the logistics consequence of having that existing European station nearby, apart from sending out for pizza?
Be much better pizza, I'm sure. We have an existing annual agreement with the French Antarctic program to share logistics, and we do that through various means with aircraft. We fly some of their expeditioners into Antarctica. They move some of our people to and from Macquarie Island occasionally. So there's a close cooperation broadly at program to program level. We have set up the Traverse to be largely an independent capability because there's reasons we want to be able to take that Traverse anywhere. But there's some logical areas in which we have collaborated and looked for things like common routes for their Traverse versus ours before we even get there. Unfortunately, that's not going to take place initially as we set up this season. But we have looked at things like the grooming of skiways, so for when aircraft go up, we're sharing those sorts of capabilities. Backup medical support. So there's a layer of collaboration behind. Some of our planning over the last couple of years has been, rightly or wrongly, slightly separate in the COVID environment. Both countries have taken a fairly stringent view to minimise the risk of disruption by each programs to limit the physical interactions where possible. And now as we're coming out of that, we're looking at opportunities to join back up again together. So yeah, basically in some of those key logistical, medical, and I think also redundancy between each of the programs. So should a Traverse fail for the French, there may be capacity to move things through by air to Wilkins that we could take up if the timing of the Traverses are different. First year having a crack at it this season, we'll see how it goes.
Thanks, Charlton. I think we have a question online.
A question from me, actually.
Oh, Dave.
Sorry, I had a question for Jaimie. So you mentioned in your talk that illegal fishing's been driven down in our area. I was just wondering what caused that. Like, is it an army of cute sniffer dogs on rafts sort of out there, or is it something else?
Well, I think Dirk's probably best placed to answer this in this room. But my understanding is the agreement between Australia and France on surveillance of the Kerguelen Plateau had a huge effect on getting rid of those illegal boats. There you go.
Very expensive going fishing in the Southern Ocean. Thanks.
There you go. Better documentation, monitoring.
Excellent. Well, thank you once again to all the speakers for this session. Jin? Sorry. Last question.
Last question, another one for Jaimie. Can you speak to the bycatch in the Heard Island region? I know it's a really productive and amazing area for biodiversity. What kind of bycatch are your fishermen pulling on board? And I guess a little plant here. Is all the bycatch alive? Not ancient? I think is my point.
Yeah, we have 5 bycatch managed species, so fish and skates and rays and shark species, but I think what you're talking about is that we have actually seen some fossils being pulled up on long lines at Heard Island, and these fossils are ancient beaked whales, and we've sent them off to the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, and one of them's over 2 million years old, but one of them, interestingly, is 10,000 years old and may actually be a beaked whale species that exists on the Kerguelen Plateau right now. We just don't know what it is. But yeah, in terms of the bycatch managed species, I've been working on a population assessment for skates. That's probably the largest biomass of bycatch that we see in the fishery. And that's been a really interesting step into the fisheries world. We've come at it at through the CAMLR bycatch management framework, so avoid, mitigate and limit. So where can we avoid them? Through move-on rules. What gear can we change? We've got a bumpy trawl net, which I'll talk a bit about later, that seems to be catching less skate, and making sure our bycatch limits are underpinned with best available data and science. So that's where we're at with bycatch. But yeah, we are seeing some improvements even just in the last couple of years.
Fantastic. Thanks once again to all of the speakers, including Dana, who couldn't join the Q&A session but gave a really beautiful presentation. Thanks very much.